Good afternoon. Good afternoon. We'll now call the Joint Study Commission on Taxation meeting to order. We'll begin by going through our roll call. I start with myself. I am Representative Penny McClammy, District 76, out of right here in Montgomery County, co-chair of the Joint Study Commission on Grocery Taxation.
Senator Andrew Jones, District 10, co-chair.
Representative Troy Stubbs, House District 31, Speaker's appointment.
Grocery, representing the Alabama grocers.
Catherine Gale Fuller, Office of the Lieutenant Governor.
Akeisha Anderson, Alabama Rise.
And we have recognized the Zoom at this point. Okay, we have established a quorum. Those members that are here, the minutes from last meeting dated November 14th, 2023 is in front of you. Have you had a moment to go through those minutes? Do you have any corrections, changes? I will state I made one change to my name. Any others? We move to adopt the minutes.
Second.
Okay. All in favor, thank you. Ayes have it. Next, we will go through, we have a presentation by Mr. Kurt Fulfoot to give us an update from the Legislative Service Agency Fiscal Division. And just to let you all know why he's coming forward, we called this meeting today because we've had some questions and some new information coming forward today about the effect of the grocery tax possibly not being able to be lowered this year. That's the purpose of today's meeting, and any questions that we may have as a commission. And we thank Mr. Fulford for coming before today to give us a presentation of where we are at this time. And thank you all for attending.
I don't have a formal presentation. I've given enough of those over the past couple of weeks. What I do have is information related to the current situation as it relates to the sales tax on food. What you have been given is a spreadsheet that tracks actual revenues from the new 3% rate since the fiscal year went into effect in October. And that's key because one of the things prior to passing the bill last year is food was categorized as everything else that was not otherwise defined. It was not a defined entity, so it just fell under the 4% rate. And so they really did not have any way of knowing exactly how much was collected on food. The estimates that we had been using historically were based on information that came off of the micro-simulation model. And their estimate based on that year's collections, how much of it related to food and the definition of food being used as the SNAP definition. If you'll look, on average, since October, it's been around 10.5 million or so. Looks like it's going up every month. The last report in January, $33 million. So I'm doing it the other way. So if you divide that by 3, that basically tells you how much is collected for each 1%. The estimate that we were using to value the cost of removing the 1% on groceries was roughly $152 million. So based on what is actually happening, it looks like the number is trending to be a little less than what we originally anticipated, which is good. What is also happening is it's having an impact on the gross sales tax receipts. Obviously, if you pull something out of the base compared to the next, it's going to have an impact on the total amount of money collected, absent everything else growing by enough to offset that. Now, the unfortunate situation is that everything else is not growing by enough to offset that. Gross sales tax receipts for the year are down by almost 5%. And they would have to have grown by roughly 4.5% to offset that $152 million estimate from lowering it by 1%. So, but that is not unsurprising. Sales tax receipts were flattening out. They had experienced, like everything else in the Education Trust Fund, exponential growth over the period between 21 and 22. Almost 15% growth in 21, which is absolutely unheard of because, we've never had a 15% growth in sales tax in the Education Trust Fund. In 2022, that number was still almost 8%. Again, that's still way too high, or way higher than what the average growth rate is. Average growth on sales tax receipts going back historically for 20 plus years is about 3.5%. So the fact that it grew by 14, almost 15% and almost 8%, we're so far out of line with what a normal situation was that it was expected for it to fall back down to something closer to a normal situation. In 2023, the growth rate on sales tax was 3.85%. So that's right in line with what average growth is. Now, what's happened since then is, changes in the economy, the exponential growth in wages and salary over the past couple of years because of the tight labor market that we've had. There's been some flexibility in that, and hopefully the wages will start flattening out. But what that means is people have less disposable income, so they're not buying as much as what they were buying when they had the excess savings from the federal assistance that showed up in 2020, 2021. If you'll remember, during the period when the individuals and businesses first started receiving those federal assistance, the economy was shut down. So there wasn't really a whole lot that they could buy with the federal assistance that was provided. We had the largest bank deposits in the history of the United States right at the onset of COVID because of the federal assistance and the inability to spend that. And what happened was, as you are well aware, increased demand, not enough supply. We wound up with historic inflation over the period of 21 and 22, and still elevated right now to the point that the Fed is contemplating maybe another change next month, although they indicated last month that they weren't going to do anything relative to lowering the rate right now because things are still uncertain. So I said all that to say, what your law, or what the law passed, says is that if estimated average growth in the Education Trust Fund for fiscal year 2025, on average between the finance department and our office, are 3.5%, then you could take another 1% off. Our estimates are not 3%. Our estimates are less than 2%. And in fact, the finance department's estimates are even less than that. So the conditions for lowering the rate again in October have not been met, and so the rate will not go down in 2025. But you still have the opportunity, because the language didn't say that provision went away at the end of this year. It says you can do it again when we certify estimates next year, and if at that point in time the average estimates are above 3.5%, you can lower the rate by the extra 1%. I think there was some confusion as far as what the language actually said. Initially, when the bill was introduced, it did say actual growth over the previous year. As that bill progressed through the process, it was changed to estimated revenue, and we certify our estimates by the third legislative day because the Constitution requires us to do that. I signed the letter last week and certified those across the desk, and so did the finance director. So that's kind of where we are right now. Total growth to the ETF current year is still negative 0.7%. It's down 21%, or $21 million over the previous year. But all of that is not sales tax. Gross sales tax is actually down 51, but net growth to the ETF is only down by 21. So there's some adjustments there in terms of the rebates, in terms of the refunds, in terms of some other things that have kind of mitigated some of that. Going forward through the rest of the year, I think some of the reductions in sales tax may be offset by some growth in income tax. Don't necessarily know that that's going to be enough to offset the decline in sales tax. And again, when you start the new fiscal year, you're not looking at differentials in tax bases. And in 2025, you'll be looking at comparing receipts in 25 that are at 3% to receipts in 24 that are also at 3%. So the situation with regard to changing the base won't be there anymore. So it should be real growth going forward into 25. And hopefully that'll be a positive growth. And we've anticipated it'll be positive, but just not enough to get you to 3.5% total growth rate. That's kind of where we are right now.
Any questions from our members?
Like, I've got a couple questions. Kirk, thank you so much for being here. This has been the first time, as you mentioned, that we have bifurcated, if that you want to use that word, two rates. Before that, we were just kind of guessing what that would be. Now that we have a separate rate on groceries, a separate rate on everything else, can we glean any comparisons with what's happening in the grocery realm versus what's happening in the other sectors with sales tax?
Yeah, I didn't bring the full printout. I can tell you that it appears as though, just based on collections, that the impact of the 1% on groceries is right now doesn't look like it's as high as what it was anticipated when you passed the bill. We're looking at roughly $152 million impact versus what on average would be $125, $130 million. So it looks like it's less. Again, we're only 4 months in. That can change. And it looks like that 3% collection figure is going up, which also means that the 1% figure is going up as well. So I don't know where we'll be at the end of the year, but right now we're trending in a way that will produce a lower number than what we originally anticipated.
I was curious because we hear so much about grocery inflation being much higher than other items of general merchandise. Do you think that is partially responsible for the reason that our numbers for our hit to the ETF are lower than we anticipated?
Could be. Obviously, some of the growth in sales tax over the past couple of years is related to that historic inflation. I mean, everything that you can think of has gone up substantially, groceries included. And so, again, some of those changes that I was referring to, other that are going to mitigate the wage and salary growth, are also going to eventually, if the Fed accomplishes what they've intended to accomplish, get inflation back down to a 2% growth rate, which should eventually result in some declining grocery prices, which would mean that the impact of the sales tax on food obviously would continue to go down.
One more question. Can we, or I guess will we, if when we have a full 12 months of data, be able to figure out where this money is, or kind of guess where this money is going into the economy? Most folks thought that when you're saving $350 a year on groceries, people are going to use that as disposable income. They're going to spend that. It's going to go back in the economy. It's going to come back into the ETF as other sales tax, or a portion of that would come back as sales tax revenue. Anything we've seen on that, or anything we could conjecture at this point?
I haven't looked at the economy as a whole. I will say this, Alabama does not tax services. And basically we're living in the service economy. So most of the money saved is probably spent on something that may not be taxed. But again, some of the things obviously would be taxed. It's obviously hasn't been a one-to-one kind of thing. Otherwise we'd be level for the year and not declining. But that's certainly something we can look at as we get toward the end of the year and run a full analysis over all the collections and see what did grow versus what declined.
I have a question. I may have missed this in your presentation. First of all, thank you for coming at such a last minute's notice to be here today. I know that we had a 3.5 growth that we were trying to meet. Where are we with that 3.5? Is it around 2 point something or what?
Yeah, so the language in the act requires a 3.5% average between our estimates and the governor's office. I can't speak to exactly what their growth rate is. I know it was less than ours, and ours was a little less than 2%. So I think theirs may have been closer to flat. So I don't know exactly what the average is. I just do know that between the two, they're not 3.5%. Current year situation. Education revenues are down by $21 million, almost negative 0.7%.
Okay. And this is just a thought that I was speaking with one of our members with earlier. Is it possible, or what would be possible if we did an amendment to lower that 3.5%?
Hey, you're the elected member. You can obviously revisit that at any point in time you want to.
Mhm.
You could change the percentage requirement. You could basically pass another bill to do another 1% without, dealing with that part of it. There's lots of options there.
What's the definition of total net receipts? Does that include any subtractions of administrative cost or earmarked disbursements?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. The monthly receipts reports, I may be the only person that does that. You probably do too. Um, there's a page on the back that gets into the monthly gross and net, and it's gross receipts from income, individual income, corporate income, minus administrative expenses, minus property tax relief. I don't want to get into what that is, but it's a
Right.
lengthy discussion. Administrative cost, as I mentioned, refund payments. That's a big contributor to reduce the gross and till you get to the net. And what the Constitution says is that the net income tax revenue gets deposited in the education trust fund. That's after all of that happens, is when it gets into the education trust fund. Similarly, on sales tax, there's several things that are deducted. Uh, Administrative cost is one of those. Also deducted is a federal requirement that we give human resources the cost of administering the SNAP program. That's deducted out of the sales tax line. We also deduct the cost of public school and college authority debt service and some other credits that have been provided over the time to get to the net number. That net number is what's deposited into the education trust fund. So the language about 3.5% is the net deposits, the net receipts that are posited in the education trust fund after all of those other things have taken place. Similarly, on the other revenue sources, it would be after any refund payments, until they get to their net number. And the net receipts is what's deposited as opposed to the gross. The gross is basic for income and sales, which is 93% of the money. They're in a separate holding account until all the other things have been deducted, and then it's deposited in the education trust fund.
Thank you.
Yes, Kurt, Wade Payne. And again, thank you for coming, your presentation. So just for clarification purposes, so I'm gonna make sure I'm on the same page. It's the net receipts that has to grow by 3.5 for us to take the other 1%.
Yeah.
And you've just talked about all the things that are affecting that net, including income tax. And we know a lot of things have been hitting the education trust fund, and a new one that's just started the first of this year is the fact that we're not taxing, there's no income tax on overtime. Do we have any kind of estimate of how much that's going to have an effect?
I haven't gotten a number on that yet. They were supposed to actually have reports of what the businesses reported to the federal government at the end of the year. I think those are due anytime now if they're not already in. And we haven't received that yet. The original estimate on that bill was a minimum cost of $45 million. And that's really important to know that that's the minimum cost based on a very limited amount of information, because we didn't have access to the reports that were filed with the federal government regarding the overtime that they're actually paying the employees. So I'm really interested to see what that number looks like as well.
Right. But in clarification, that number will now be being subtracted before we get to the net. So will have an effect.
Now, the way they're going to do it, it won't come in as a gross. So it's withholdings, right?
Right.
So
Right.
it's you'll pay less to that line as it comes in. It won't factor in down here after as a deduction or anything. It just won't be paid on the top end.
I
Thank
want to
you.
make note. I'm sorry. I want to make note that we have another member that joined us through Zoom. If you could introduce yourself, and if you all in Zoom have any questions. Mr. Coleman? Okay. I do have one more question. School vouchers or tax credits, are they subtracted from the growth?
Hasn't happened yet, so I mean, they won't be subtracted until or unless that bill passes in some form or another and it's an income tax credit. We factor all of that into our estimates when we make our estimates for the subsequent year based on the information that we have. I think that bill proposes a maximum of $100 million
Right,
to
100
begin in
million.
2026. I think the supplemental appropriation bill has some money in there to go into the fund to start that process. And to the extent that that's used to offset the amount that you'd otherwise appropriate, it's, just a ending balance thing as opposed to an incoming revenue thing. I know that makes no sense. I'd be glad to explain further if somebody wants me to.
Yeah, I was gonna say break it down, but yeah,
You don't.
it's out too late.
So, Kirk, the nutshell of what I'm getting is any tax cut extra that we do or anything that we do that costs additional money like vouchers, all of that is going to affect our net bottom line, which is going to impact whether or not we can have a grocery tax.
Absolutely.
So
And
perhaps hindsight being 2020, gross would have been a better term to use in the bill.
maybe, but it wouldn't have been your friend this year if you were just looking at sales tax, because the gross sales tax is down by almost 5%, as opposed to the net of everything being only down 0.7%. So sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. It kind of depends on what all is being deducted in that particular year.
Fair enough.
Have anyone else? Thank you so much. Appreciate you.
Thank you.
I'll turn it over to my co-chair.
Okay. Thank you, Representative McClammy. Next on our presenter list, we'll have Akeisha Anderson with Alabama Arise. And we're getting you set up where you can be visible to our folks on Zoom.
Perfect. Well, while she does that, I do want to say thank you, Senator Jones and Representative McClammy, for giving me the opportunity to speak to you all today.
Thank you.
Well, I know you all will have copies of these slides to follow along with me, but thank you again for giving me this opportunity to speak. For those in the room who are unfamiliar with who I am, my name is Akeisha Anderson. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Director for Alabama Arise. Next slide, whenever you're ready. Just as a brief introduction to who Alabama Arise is, we are a nonpartisan 501c3 nonprofit organization composed of over 150 member organizations and over 1,500 additional individual members. Our work is dedicated to advancing public policies that improve the lives of poor and low-income Alabamians. Next slide. Oh, you're on the right slide. All right, so today I'm going to talk to you about a few things. I'm going to go over some of the numbers. So some of this may be a repetition of what Kirk just shared, but I'm going to talk about the impact of the grocery tax reduction on the ETF, on families, as well as the impact of inflation and other market realities that are impacting our families currently. I'm also going to talk about food insecurity in Alabama and why all of this matters, as well as some recommendations about what we might be able to do now by looking back at last year's commentary related to the grocery tax and assessing what our upcoming priorities are and how we might want to modify those to address the needs of everyday people. Next slide, please. So we all know that on September 1st, the 1 cent reduction in the state level grocery tax went into effect. And that reduction has helped over 1.9 million households in the state. These households have received relief when purchasing groceries. In the first 5 months of the 1% reduction in food sales tax, the net loss in state revenue from sales tax was about $33 million. And that is according to the budget hearing from last week and data shared by Kirk. So me being a lawyer and not, great at math, I'm just going to throw out some numbers, but dividing 33 million by 5 gets me to 6.6 million, which means that I am estimating that the net loss per month was about 6.6 million per month. Thus, if current trends continue, what I'm estimating is similar to what Kirk shared, is that the net loss is going to be significantly less than what we anticipated, that 152 million, which was the fiscal note of last year. If current trends continue, the net loss will possibly only be 79 million. Assuming that there might be some upticks during the summer when children are out of school, even if the rate doubles during those 3 months that children are out of school, the overall net loss will still be under 100 million a year. And that's going to be important later in this presentation. Next slide, please. So I shared that at Arise, we work for Alabamians that are marginalized by poverty and that are low income. The average income in Alabama is about $60,000 a year. Within Alabama, the median household size is about 2.53. So I'm just going to say 3 people. Compared to the national average, Alabama has a much higher percentage of female-headed households. So a lot of single moms, 43.1% of households are headed by women. In addition, it is worth noting that many single mothers are surviving off of an income lower than that $60,000 a year, and that only 17% of Alabama single mothers receive financial assistance via child support. This matters because when we talk about who is impacted by this grocery tax cut and who we are benefiting, we are, of course, benefiting more than just single moms, but that is one population that I'm particularly concerned about. Using the USDA's Thrifty Food Plans, low-cost meal plan calculations, a household of 3 with various makeups spend the following amounts on food each month. So a family of 3 with 2 adults aged 19 to 50 and 1 child, so a 2-parent household with a child under 2, would spend about $672.40 per month on groceries. A family of 3 with a single mother and 2 children between the ages of 9 to 11 would spend closer to $770 per month on groceries. Translated to the impact of the grocery tax, under each of these scenarios, Alabama families can expect to spend somewhere between $242 per year or $276 per year on the grocery tax. And for each family, the amount that they pay in the state level grocery tax is actually more than what it costs for them to purchase 1.5 weeks worth of groceries. I will highlight that according to the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, these numbers from the Thrifty Food Plan are actually lowball costs. They currently are based on food costs when you buy raw materials that often require about 2 hours worth of prep time, which is a burden or barrier for many single parents, including those that I just spoke about. Next slide. So Senator Jones asked about inflation and other market realities. And thanks to a combination of inflation, pandemic-related supply chain disruptions, and tariffs on certain foreign imports, Food prices have steadily risen since 2020. According to the USDA, food prices increased by 5.8% in 2023, and food prices are expected to continue to rise this year, although less drastically. Despite inflation and other market forces that have driven the cost of food up, unfortunately, income rates have not risen at similar rates. Thus, consumer debt is something that we are noticing is rising throughout households within the state, and household savings are declining at the same time. Despite the fiscal binds that people find themselves in, everybody, no matter how much they earn, still has to eat. Thus, sales tax on groceries disproportionately fall on people and families with lower incomes. They also require that these people spend a larger share of their income on food. And also, it has been found that states who impose income tax on groceries tend to have disposable income today. Next slide, please. So I shared that many families are losing about 1.5 work weeks of groceries via the current level of the state level grocery tax. Worth noting is that for some that may be a nominal amount, but for many others it is not. Over 16% of Alabama's population, including nearly 24% of Alabama's children, live in poverty. You all already know that Alabama is the nation's 6th poorest state, with more than 800,000 people, including 250,000 children, living below the poverty line. While not the only ones in poverty, I will be amiss if I don't state that these poverty rates are felt more harshly in communities of color, as you can see on the screen. In many instances, there is an overlap between poverty and food insecurity. Nearly 15% of Alabamians experience food insecurity, including nearly 20% of children. And based on 22 considered low-income working families with children. These are families with children under the age of 18 and people with income less than 200% of the federal poverty line, despite the fact that they worked at least 50 weeks or more during the previous year. In addition, those single mothers that I talked about a moment ago, are one of the most likely households to experience food insecurity. So the point, why am I sharing all of this? So at Alabama Arise, we have been listening very closely to our members and what they have to say about the impact of the grocery tax cut. And one common theme that is shared is similar to some of these clips that I pulled from news articles on this slide. It's a great start, but it's not enough. Everything keeps going up, that despite, the grocery tax cut, people are still having hard times keeping up with the rising costs of groceries and everything else. And so I point this out simply because despite the fact that the ETF is only projected to grow by approximately 2% in the upcoming year, it is important to share that low income and poor families still need more relief now, if possible, from the state level grocery tax. Next slide, please. So one thing that we can consider doing, and when I say we, I mean the legislators on the committee, is we can actually consider whether or not we can provide more relief now by doing exactly what Representative McClammy shared. If we were to modify the legislation that was introduced last year, that would be something that really could provide immediate relief to families. As you all may recall, the legislation that was introduced last year initially had language before it was amended that stated the rate of tax shall only be reduced if the growth in total net receipts from all revenue sources to the ETF in the immediately preceding fiscal year was at least 2% more than the prior fiscal year. If you all decide to change it back to that initial language, that's an option, but there are other options out there. But I would strongly encourage you all to look back at whether or not you might want to consider modifying that language to provide that relief to everyday families that need it now. Next slide, please. I want to share a quote from Lieutenant Governor Ainsworth last year. He stated, estimated total receipts for the ETF in the upcoming fiscal year amount to almost $11 billion alone. In addition, we began the year with a $3 billion carry forward, and we have billions of dollars in savings accounts. Given those figures, claiming that we cannot sustain the loss in revenues that would result from a grocery tax repeal defies simple arithmetic, violates basic common sense, and opposes the conservative beliefs and values that guide the vast majority of Alabamians. Next slide, please. Although this is a different principle, it is similar in this new year. Currently, estimated total receipts for the ETF in the upcoming fiscal year would allow for an increase in ETF appropriations of nearly $550 million. Under conservative estimates, which we have shown may not hold out to be true, but even under conservative estimates in which the grocery tax would cost at most an additional $152 million, the ETF, if we were to cut that 1 cent again, would still have an additional $400 million cushion this upcoming fiscal year. So given those figures, I would argue that similar to what Lieutenant Governor Ainsworth shared last year, claiming that we cannot sustain the loss in revenues that would result from another grocery tax cut would still defy simple arithmetic. So given the needs of everyday Alabamians, this is an issue that I really encourage us to prioritize, especially given other threats to the ETF that will be distributed in a less equitable way if they are distributed. Next slide, please. So one question that I really want us to think about is just what our priorities are this upcoming session. At the end of the day, it all comes down to choices, the choices that we make, why we make them, and who we make them for. And one choice that we are possibly about to make is one that will prioritize paying from the ETF up to $7,000 per child, and according to the legislation, not less than $100 million total each year for children in the state to attend non-public schools. And so a question that I have is just a simple question of arithmetic. How can we afford or justify paying up to $7,000 per child to attend these non-public schools when we cannot afford to give every family 1 more cent off the grocery tax? And as shared earlier in the presentation, that additional 1.5 weeks of groceries that families are currently missing out on via the grocery tax that they pay is under $300 a year for a family of 3. And so what does it say about us and our commitment to everyday Alabamians and truly working to eliminate this regressive tax if we are not willing to finish what we started last year? So I know that we can always come back in a future year, but I do just want to stress that this is a pain point for many Alabamians right now. And it is something that I really do encourage us to try to see if we can do something to address now rather than later. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for Keisha? All right. Thank you very much,
Thank
ma'am.
you.
We appreciate you. Next, we'll have the Alabama Grocers Association. I believe Ellie is going to come and present.
Good afternoon, everybody. Last time we did a formal presentation from the grocers, but today I just wanted to make just a few comments. First and foremost, I just want to thank this committee. As you know, the Grocery Association had been working on the reduction of this grocery tax for well over a decade, along with a lot of other groups, and it's because of the hard work of the people in this room that this came to fruition. So I just want to thank you for all of that. I also want to say, of course, this was the largest tax cut for Alabamians in history. I've heard Senator Jones say that many times. It was, and 83% of Alabamians supported the removal of the grocery tax. People in Alabama want this. We see firsthand as grocers, hardworking Alabamians that come into our store that are not able to buy the groceries that we need. So we know that this is definitely a priority for the state of Alabama. And if you remember back to the legislation, just food for thought, 101 representatives and 35 of the 35 senators signed on to this bill. This was a priority for the legislature. To have that much camaraderie between lines and to have that many people sign on to a bill is almost unheard of here in the state. And so just want to put that in perspective as we keep moving forward. 69% of shoppers in our stores are saying that they spent more on groceries this year than they did last year. And that has to do, of course, with inflation, as all of you know. And the average spend, according to the Food Marketing Institute, per week is $155. I do want to say thank you to our grocery community that supported this with us, that knew that we needed, that hardworking Alabamians wanted this tax reduction. I think it went fairly seamlessly. We had one little glitch with one grocer, and they fixed it very quickly and also rewarded their customers then for coming back and for telling them when they paid with cash. But anybody that paid by credit card was corrected. But 99% of the grocers in Alabama did this correctly. We worked very, very hard to make sure all of our people knew, to make sure all of the points for the people of Alabama. So just want to give a shout out to the grocery community for being able to do this and doing this so well. Also, from a perspective, any type of reduction on groceries. So for point of sale companies, for large chains in other states, for those people, they were already doing this. Throughout the entire country, they were already reducing it, some 1 or 2%, some by a certain margin. But those point of sale systems, as we brought forward when we were talking about this last year, were absolutely able to do this because they did it in almost every state around the country. And so I'm proud to say that we are now not one of the 3 states that don't have any reduction on groceries. At least we have something, but we need to move forward. We need to do this for Alabamians. We see it every day. And so as we move forward into this legislative session and we're talking about taking different monies from the EFT for different projects and things, I just wanted to have legislators be cognizant that anything that we do then is going to reduce the percentage potentially of having this grocery tax next year. And you can see from having 101 representatives and 35 out of the 35 senators sign on to the bill, it's a priority for legislators as well. So I think we just need a reminder of that and where we've been and moving forward. So thank you, everyone in this room, for your hard work. I'm not going to go over insecurity numbers. We work on that a lot, but Arise has done a wonderful job today of doing that. And so I'm not going to do that again as well. But anyway, thank you all so very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Any questions for Ellie? Okay. I'd like to recognize Allison King, who joined us, our education representative on the panel. Allison, do you have anything you want to share or ask about? We're just glad to have you with us. Yes, we can get you a copy. Okay, we're at the time of the meeting where we're have the floor open for any discussion from the commission members or anything we missed or may want to discuss at a future meeting that we can get information on. Now's the time to bring that to our attention.
One of the things that Kurt pointed out was when he was talking about the history of the Education Trust Fund, the tremendous growth it had had in the last 3 years with all the inflation. And when you talk about a 21% and whatever, and I think in hindsight, and I appreciate what the legislature has done here, but when they set this up for the 3.5% based on the preceding year, when you're coming, all of us in business have seen our businesses jump way up, but then we've kind of seen them flatten out, and we're kind of in a catch-up mode. Maybe a better number would have been gone back and looked at maybe compared it to a 5-year average versus the preceding or something like that. That would be more realistic. She makes a good point. Still, the Education Trust Fund has a surplus, so there is money there. But maybe it was just the wording, and if we'd looked at it compared to a 5-year average, we may be closer to there. I don't know, Kurt probably can speak more to that, but I'm just trying to find a way to, for y'all as legislators, because it looks like it's going to be a legislative solution more than anything else to get that other 1%.
That's a great point. I saw Representative Stubbs looking like he might want to, you're heavily contemplating whether to say something or not, so.
I appreciate everybody's presentations and all the information provided. I think as a new member of the legislature and someone who's fascinated with numbers, as Kirk mentioned, I think that it's difficult with all of the contributing factors that go into the ETF and just the way we differentiate between gross and net. And when we look, as you mentioned, Senator, earlier, the expectation that the 1% that the individuals, all households are getting or saving, where that is being redistributed within our state economy. And if that, in fact, is being put back in one of the buckets that goes into the ETF, then we see that it doesn't have the overwhelming financial impact that many were fearful of. But we don't really have enough data right now to determine where that money is being redistributed and how the long-term effect would be. But I also recognize that there are certainly many contributing factors to the households that you serve and the households that were mentioned with respect to food insecurities. And so as we try to balance meeting the immediate needs now, which are certainly there, but also solving the long-term problem, which is moving people out of poverty. So how do we do that? Well, I believe education is one of the solutions. There are many others. So we've got to identify how we can resolve the immediate needs of the families, which are the definite food insecurity issues that are prevalent across the state in many different households, while also making sure that all of our education institutions are meeting the needs of the students so that we don't have a cycle of poverty, but rather we find a way to stop that. And so I think collectively, we need to find a way to do both. We need to be able to meet the immediate needs, but we also need to be able to resolve the cycle of poverty or try to remedy that through education and other things. If we can find a way to balance both, we've got a lot of smart people in the legislature. I think we can find a way to do it.
Great point. Akeisha.
I'm trying to figure out who my question is for. This might be for Mr. Fulford, Kirk. Can you share whether or not there has been legislation, and forgive me if this came up at our last committee meeting, our commission meeting, has there been legislation introduced in the past to address services, the sales tax, or taxing services like you touched on earlier?
Yeah, I've been around long enough to have actually experienced one of those attempts, and it was not pretty. So you just imagine accountants, doctors, dentists, everybody you can possibly think of who currently don't collect sales taxes on the people they provide services to would now be required to collect sales taxes on those services. I think when Governor Riley, one of the first things he did, his tax proposal in 2003, was going to try to close that gap on services on just one service. It was auto related. You go into the auto shop, you get your oil changed, they charge you tax on the filter. They don't charge you tax on the labor because they can't. They were trying to close that gap, and that may have been one of the many reasons why that proposal didn't go anywhere. But it wasn't very popular with the people that were in that business. I say that to say the only two states that I'm aware of that do wholeheartedly tax services are New Mexico and Hawaii. Hawaii, for obvious reasons, they've got a limited economy, and they have to tax it going and coming, and they do. They tax it coming in and going out. New Mexico taxes services to some extent, but I will say that they ran into a situation that rendered their ability to tax doctors and dentists and everyone else to be something that they were no longer willing to pursue. So they dropped that tax several years ago. It gets into the issue of who's paying the tax, right? Most 70% of your health insurance is covered by a private insurance provider. So are you taxing the private insurance provider? Are you taxing the individual? When they go to the doctor's only collecting the copay on that insurance. So is your tax on the copay or your tax on the actual service provided, and you don't get the bill until 2 months later. So they ran into issues in terms of how to collect that. But yes, there's been, I want to say it was early 2000s. Prior to that, there was, and actually late 1990s, a group that was formed to look at taxation of services and the things that we could and couldn't tax and what it might benefit. Now, also, we haven't approached that again recently, so that may be something definitely. That's where, look, we live in a service economy, so it's not something that we can ignore anymore, but you have to understand that there's ramifications to each one of those, and it's a matter of whether you can jump in with both feet or inch along that process to get you to where you want to go.
And a follow-up question, I believe there's legislation that has been introduced to increase the tax rate on internet sales. Is that correct?
I don't know if it's been introduced yet. I am aware of of a bill that, yes, would increase
And if
the
that
tax
passed, would
rate.
that money go to the ETF?
Uh, Not the one that I'm referring to, no.
Okay.
That has been a long-standing issue with local governments as far as what they perceive to be an inequity in the simplified seller's use tax and how much money that they get back versus the state. So the local taxes are higher than the state taxes, but they're getting the same amount as a whole back versus what they perceive to be their fair share.
Okay. Thank you.
And in response to your question, the 5-year average I mentioned is 3.5. If you go all the way back to 2002, is 3.7% if you start at the end of the Great Recession and come to the beginning of the COVID recession. So it's within that realm of possibilities is 3.5. It just so happens that, we knew there was a flattening out to come, and that we're flattening out at the moment, or seeing it right now in overall receipts.
Allison.
Kirk, and I came in. I apologize for my tardiness. I had another meeting that ran over, so you may have already addressed this in your conversation. From our standpoint, we certainly do not mind cuts on the grocery tax. That's excellent, but we would like to find a way to replace the revenues. Our schools are in desperate need of a lot of things still, regardless of record budgets and all these things. Most of you are probably aware through the budget hearings last week, but our schools are our state's going to have to take on a lot of responsibility financially that the COVID funds are running out on. So we've got leveling out of the funding. And in addition to that, we have additional demands on our state to pick up some of these things that have been done through COVID relief funds, hundreds of millions of dollars. So it's hard to look and say, oh, well, the ETF is still strong. It is, but we're about to get a huge influx starting this fiscal year of additional demands on our budget as well. So there's a lot to
Yeah,
it. But as far as
before
cutting,
and after school care programs
Yeah.
that were funded pretty much entirely with federal money over the past 2 years are now becoming our responsibility. It is quite a substantial investment or use of the K-12 portion of the money. And I continue to go back. If anybody heard me last week, my ongoing concern budget-wise is about the expenditure side as opposed to the receipt side, not because we don't have it locked up and that you can't spend more than a certain amount, but because of all the requests are going to come in when the federal money does run out. Remember, the local K-12 schools got over $3 billion in federal money. They're still trying to spend that money, and it's going away in 2025, 2026. And about 35 to 40% of that, as last I looked, was spent on people and benefits. So are you no longer going to have the people? If there'll be lots of people coming to you to ask you to support a program that was propped up with federal money that they can no longer afford because they don't have the local money to support the program they started with federal money. But you've only got a finite amount of money that you're allowed to spend every year. So that's going to be a problem for you coming up pretty soon.
that was all I had. Was we're in full support if we can find another way to increase some revenues elsewhere.
Any other questions or comments? Any topics for our next meeting anybody would like to see discussed? There are quite a bunch for the most part. All right. Well, with that, we will at some point have another meeting. Of course, that's TBD. Appreciate everyone being here on short notice. Thanks to our media friends for coming out as well. If there's nothing else, we stand adjourned.